strewn on the wayside for miles and miles and miles. So when the Soviets arrived at Auschwitz, they found 7,000 people who were very frail and actually had been left behind because they were so frail.
Claire Pacquelin, thanks very much. I think we should cross live now and listen to this ceremony, which is just getting underway. The music you're listening to there is by Simon James. He is a German composer who himself was killed in the gas chambers at Auschwitz.
Szanowni Państwo,
ladies and gentlemen,
spotykamy się dziś przed bramą wjazdową
we
do
meeting
Birkenau.
here today at the gate to Birkenau. Standing before us is a railway wagon, a symbol of the suffering of all the victims of the Auschwitz concentration camp and extermination center. In particular, it is a reference to the tragic transports of the Hungarian Jews in 1944, the climax of the operation of this horrible place. This wagon was placed here on this very ramp 15 years ago as a symbol, thanks to the generous support of Frank Lowy. May the silent emptiness of this wagon be filled today with our living memory of all those who perished in Auschwitz.
Na dzisiejszych obchodach pragnę powitać
It is my honor to extend a warm welcome to the survivors.
Witam głowy koronowane.
May I welcome their majesties, presidents, prime ministers, and all the heads of national delegations.
Witam przedstawicieli
May I welcome
Parlamentu
representatives
Polskiego
of the Polish
oraz
Parliament
parlamentarzystów z
and
Europy i
parliamentarians
świata.
from across Europe and around the world.
Witam
I
przedstawicieli
welcome
korpusu
members
dyplomatycznego.
of the diplomatic corps.
Witam darczyńców.
I welcome the benefactors who have contributed to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation Perpetual Fund, the Pillars of Remembrance. I welcome representatives of churches and religious communities, including Jewish communities and organizations, as well as the Roma community. I welcome representatives of regional and local authorities. I welcome all representatives of institutions and organizations and all the persons in attendance who have come to today's commemoration. May I ask for a welcome on behalf of the survivors. I'm asking Marian Turski, who survived Auschwitz and is a member of the International Auschwitz Council.
Well, you can see slowly walking up to the stage there, Marianne Tursky. She is a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp and an international, the head of the International Auschwitz Council as well there. He's walking slowly up to the stage.
W imieniu wszystkich
On behalf
ocalałych
of all the survivors,
witam dostojnych gości.
I welcome the distinguished
Witam
guests.
wszystkich
I
zgromadzonych
welcome
w tym
all
namiocie.
who have gathered here in this tent.
Witam słuchaczy
I welcome
i
those
widzów
who are listening to us on the radio and who watch us on TV and in all the other
ale
media.
przede wszystkim
However, first and
najgorętsze
foremost,
myśli
my warmest thoughts and feelings
dla was,
go towards you,
moi towarzysze
my
i moi
fellows,
towarzysze niedoli,
men and women who have shared this misery with me, the inmates.
dziś obchodzimy
Today we commemorate
Dzień
the
Pamięci
International
o ofiarach Holokaustu.
Day of
International
Remembrance
Holocaust Remembrance Day.
of the victims of the Holocaust.
Zrozumiałą,
It is absolutely
nawet
understandable,
oczywistą,
if not
że ludzie,
downright obvious,
że media
that people,
do nas
that
się
the media
zwracają,
turn to
do
us,
którzy
to those
ocaleli,
who
abyśmy
survived,
podzielili się
so that we shared with them our memories.
ale nas była
However,
zawsze maleńka
there's always
mniejszość,
been a very small minority of us,
którzy przeszli
us
w swoim czasie
who
pozytywne selekcje,
went through all those selections positively.
było bardzo, bardzo niewiele,
That number itself was very
którzy doczekali
little,
wolności,
and those who lived to see freedom,
prawie
there were
prawie
hardly
niewiele, zupełnie niewiele.
none. So few.
A teraz
And now
została tylko
there is only a handful.
dlatego,
Such a small bevy.
że nasze
That is why
myśli
I believe that our thoughts
powinniśmy skierować
should now
ku
go
olbrzymiej
towards
większości,
this huge majority,
tym milionom,
those millions of victims
które nigdy nam nie powiedzą,
who will never tell us what they experienced, what they felt,
ponieważ
just
pochłonęła
because
je
they
zagłada.
were consumed by that mass destruction,
Zachował się
the Shoah.
wszakże pewien
However,
dokument,
there is a certain document
dokument,
that has survived,
wiersz,
a document, a poem,
który w jakimś stopniu
that to a particular degree
coś tam mówi nam o tych właśnie ludziach.
tells us something about those very people.
Zapamiętajcie Państwo
And do remember the name.
Henryka Łazowert.
It's by Henryka Łazowert.
Łazowert.
Henryka Łazowert.
Była nawet była polską poetką.
She was a Polish poetess.
Miała nawet bardzo udane próby.
She had very successful attempts at writing literature.
Miała możliwość ukrycia
She
się
had an opportunity to
poza murami,
hide
ale nie
beyond
chciała
the walls
zostawić
of the ghetto,
matki.
but she was loath to
Kiedy
leave her
dzisiaj
mother behind.
Słucham,
Today, when I listen
wydaje mi się, jakby to było coś
to her
poza
poem,
sezonowego.
I find it as something that goes absolutely beyond any
Jest to
thing
dokument.
that the mind can imagine. This is
Mamy
a document.
jej zdjęcie.
We have a
Była
photo
urodziwą
of Henryka.
kobietą.
She was a beautiful
lat
woman.
33.
She was
Była
33.
już uznaną poetką.
By that time, she had been a recognized poet,
Polską.
a Polish poet.
Pisała po polsku,
She wrote in Polish,
ale jako
and
Żydówka
as a Jewess,
została,
she was sentenced to annihilation.
miała szansę ukrycia się po tak zwanej
She had an opportunity
aryjskiej
to
stronie.
find a hiding place on the so-called Aryan side,
Opuścić
but
matki.
she didn't want to
Napisała
leave her mother.
list
She wrote a letter, a
do
poem
swojego przyjaciela.
to her friend.
Zacytuję ten
Let me quote that letter.
odjeżdżam gdzieś tam,
I'm going
bardzo daleko,
somewhere there,
do stacji
to a very distant place,
nieznajomej, której
a
nie
station
ma na
that is
żadnej
unknown,
mapie.
for it is not in any
Nad
map.
dworcem niebo wisi
There
jak
is
wielkie
the sky hanging
czarne
over the station
wieko.
like a huge black
Lokomotywa
lid.
krzyczy
The engine
głosem
shrieks
bitego
with the
człowieka.
voice of a beaten man.
Kolejarze mają
The train
ważne
drivers
jak
have the
papier.
faces of
Mam z sobą
paper.
tylko jedną
All I
walizkę
have with me is just
i
one
jeden
suitcase
żal,
and
którego
one
nikt nie
grief
próbował zgłębić.
that no one's ever tried to plummet.
Bardzo spokojna.
I'm so very
to,
composed,
czego nie widać.
and what you cannot see at
Bardzo
all,
smutna.
so very sad.
Bądź zdrów,
Be
mój
healthy,
są
my distant,
serca, gdzie
There are
nic
hearts
się nie zmienia.
where nothing changes.
Mnie już nie ma.
I am
Nie ma.
no longer. No longer.
Poproszę obecnych o
May I
powstanie,
ask all the present
minutę milczenia.
to stand up for a moment's silence?
Dziękuję.
Thank you.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much.
Drodzy przyjaciele,
Dear friends,
od co najmniej 2000 lat
for at least 2,000 years
naszej cywilizacji
of our civilization,
towarzyszy
we've been accompanied by a vision
apokalipsy.
of apocalypsis.
Oto pojawiają się 4 jeźdźcy
Here
apokalipsy.
The four riders of apocalypse arrive:
zaraza,
war, pestilence, hunger, and death.
ludzie są porażeni,
People are perplexed with fear, paralyzed with that fear.
czują się całkowicie
And they
bezradni.
feel absolutely helpless.
Co robić?
What can be done?
Chciałbym tutaj
At this
zacytować,
point, I would like to quote
którą
a
na
song
pewno
that
wielu z was
certainly many of you
rozpoznałoby, gdybym
would
ją
recognize
zanucił.
if
Nie
I
ma
hummed
obawy.
the tune,
Nie
but
będę
don't worry,
śpiewał,
I'm not going to sing.
ale
But all I want is to draw your attention
tekst
to the lyrics,
niesłychanie
because
inspirujący.
these lyrics are exceptionally inspiring.
Którego autorem
The author of the lyrics is
Rabbi Nachman,
Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav,
ale znany bardziej
who was
jako
better known
Rabbi
as
Nachman
Rabbi
Humania,
Nachman of Human,
ponieważ tam
because
kazał
that
się
was where
pochować
he
między
had his body buried
ofiar
among
pogromu.
the graves of the victims of a pogrom.
Kol ha'olam kulo. Cały nasz świat, nasz świat.
All our world, the whole world we have,
Sarmod jest niczym
is nothing,
bardzo wąski,
a very narrow bridge,
haikar, a co najważniejsze,
and which is most
lo
important,
lefachet klal, nie bać się wcale.
one must not be afraid at all.
A więc
Thus,
nie bać się.
not to be
Widzimy
afraid,
w świecie
we see
współczesnym
in the contemporary
Dzisiaj.
world
teraz
today
wielki
and
wzrost
now
antysemityzmu.
we see a huge
A to
rise
przecież
in anti-Semitism,
właśnie antysemityzm
and that is
doprowadził
precisely
do Holokaustu.
anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust.
Deborah Lipstadt
Deborah
nazwała
Lipstadt
to
called it
tsunami antysemityzmu.
the tsunami
A
of
to właśnie
anti-Semitism,
jej odwaga,
and it
jej
was
uporność
her
i wytrwałość
courage,
w
her
walce z
tenacity in
Holokaustu,
fighting with
czyli
Holocaust denial,
of the Holocaust,
which in English is called the denial of the Holocaust,
zakończyła się
put
sukcesem po
an end to
wygranym
it.
w
It
Londynie
ended in a success
procesie
after
z
she won a
Davidem
trial
Irvingiem.
against David Irving in London.
Nie bójmy się wykazać
Let us not
takiej samej
fear
odwagi dzisiaj,
demonstrating the same courage today
czyni
when Hamas
próby zaprzeczania
attempts
masakry
at denial
7
of
października.
the massacre of the 7th of October.
Nie bójmy się
Let us not
przeciwstawiać
oppose
teoriom spiskowym, że
the
wszystko,
conspiration
co
theories
złe na świecie,
saying that all the evil of this world results from a plot started by some indefinite social groups, and Jews are often mentioned as one of
Nie
such.
bójmy się
Let us not
rozmawiać
fear
o problemach
discussing the problems that torment
ostatnie
the so-called last generation.
naruszają. Co prawda ci młodzi ludzie
These young people may disturb our social order, they may disturb our system of
ale
truth,
sędzia,
yet
który wydał wyrok,
whether the judge has pronounced the sentence when he uttered those memorable words,
wskazują
perhaps today I sentence tomorrow's heroes.
nie bójmy się
Let us not be afraid
samych siebie,
to convince
że można
ourselves
rozwiązywać
that we
problemy
can
między
solve
sąsiadami.
problems between
Od setek
neighbors, because
na
for
różnych
centuries, on many continents, many nations, many peoples,
grupy
and
etniczne
many ethnic groups
mieszkały
have
i
lived
żyły obok
and
siebie
have
i między
had their
sobą.
homes among
Uprzedzenia wzajemne,
one another and between one another.
nienawiść
All the hatred,
doprowadzały
all
do
the
konfliktów
hate speech
zbrojnych
led to
między
armed
tymi
conflicts
sąsiadującymi
between those
narodami
neighboring
i grupami
peoples and
etnicznymi.
ethnic groups.
Kończyło się to
That
zawsze,
always
przelewem
ended in
krwi.
bloodshed.
ale są na szczęście
Yet, luckily,
doświadczenia
there are
pozytywne,
the positive
gdy
experiences
obie
as well
strony
when
dochodzą
both
do
the sides
wniosku, że nie
reach a
mają
conclusion
innego
that they
sposobu
have no
zapewnienia
other way of
spokojnego,
ensuring a
bezpiecznego
peaceful, safe and
życia
secure life
swoim dzieciom,
for their children,
wnukom,
grandchildren, and for the future generations
doprowadzenia
than
do
leading
kompromisu.
to a compromise.
Powołam się na dwa
Let me
przykłady
quote here
z
two
Europy.
examples from
Niemcy
Europe:
i Francuzi,
Germans
Polacy
and the French,
i Litwini.
Poles and Lithuanians.
Powtórzę,
Let me
nie bójmy
reiterate,
się
let us not
przekonać
fear
samych siebie,
convincing
że trzeba
ourselves
mieć
that
wizję
one
tylko
needs to
tego,
have a
co
vision
dziś jest,
not only
ale
of what
tego,
is here
co będzie
today, but
jutro,
also what is going to come
będzie
tomorrow
za
and
kilkadziesiąt
what will come
lat.
in several decades.
Dziękuję
Thank
za
you
uwagę.
for your attention.
You were listening there to Marianne Tursky from the International Auschwitz Council. Coming up next, some more music. This will be by Józef Krupinski. It's called Longing Can't Find. Now, it's worth saying as well that Krupinski was a Polish musician, a Polish composer. He was at Auschwitz for some time, deported there in 1940. He then, though, went to the Buchenwald concentration camp where he was liberated in 1945. So it is his music that we are to hear next.
Teraz wysłuchajmy głosu
Now,
świadków.
let us listen
O zabranie
to the
głosu proszę
witnesses.
ocalałą z
May I
obozu
ask
Auschwitz,
a
panią
survivor,
Janinę Iwańską.
Ms. Janina Iwańska, to take the floor.
Well, just to tell you a little bit about who it is that we're hearing from now, this is Jania Iwańska. She was born in Warsaw, in Poland. She lived through the occupation of Warsaw. She was deported to Auschwitz in 1944.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Let's listen to her now.
half a year ago, in June, I was here to commemorate the first transport of inmates to Auschwitz. These were Polish inmates that had been moved here from Darmstadt. 728 people altogether. This was the 84th anniversary of the first transport. This is the 80th anniversary of the camp liberation, when the camp stopped its operation. 4.5 years. This is how the camp operated. Now, this camp changed significantly. Originally, it was a camp for political prisoners, people who were not happy with German occupation. These were mostly Poles, mostly adults. Then, Poles were no longer allowed to form associations, including scouting. This is when younger people, boys, would be moved here, teenage boys, for their activity in the scouting, Polish scouting movement. So, for a time, most of the inmates were Poles here. Then, this camp turned into a camp for Soviet POWs. Tens of thousands of POWs were moved here. But these were not, or rather this camp became a labor camp. So firstly, in August, those Russians and Poles would become subjects. They were used to test various killing gases to see which gas would be the most efficient. Then in September 1941, those Soviet POWs that survived were moved to Brzezinka, the village of Brzezinka. This is where we are, and this is where, when then started building the Birkenau camp, and they worked throughout a very heavy winter. Remember, winters here were truly tragic. Lots of poverty, lots of very hard work, and little to eat. If you disliked anything, you would be killed. March 1942, this is when the camp was commissioned. 12,000 survivors were moved here, but only 500 survived. Once Birkenau was ready, women would be brought in, because until that point there had been no women. Women from Poland and from all over Europe. Belgians, French, Czech, Romanian women, and most of them were Polish. Now, the operators of the camp, which gas worked the best, which is when they started building gas chambers. In autumn, they started the construction of the gas chambers and the crematoria. April next year, the crematoria were ready. So were the gas chambers. And that is when it was no longer a POW camp, a Soviet camp. This is when the killing machine started its operation. This is when the killing factory started its operation. All they would do here would be killing people. Some people would be moved to other camps, but most would be exterminated. It is difficult to calculate all the people killed here. Most would be registered, marked, but many a time inmates, people would be brought in here from other countries, and they would be driven directly to gas chambers and crematoria. It is calculated that around 1 million Jews were murdered this way, so they would be taken directly from the ramp to the gas chambers. Nobody knows exactly how many people died here. Now, the year was 1943. Apart from Jews and Aryan people from all over Europe and other continents, including Asia and North America, they would bring in Roma. They called it the Gypsy camp. Roma and Sinti would be put there. They called it the family camp. Families would be brought in here, Roma with their wives and children. Dr. Mengele would take care of them. Even before the war, Mengele actually had conducted experiments aimed at proving that the German race was superior. All the others were inferior, and the Jews and the Roma were basically inhuman, so they should be exterminated. The Roma were brought in here in whole families because he specialized in conducting experiments on children. Where you had a family, there were also children then, and they, or rather then, he would experiment on newborns, on babies. Many Roma died here because of diseases, misery. Now, in August 1943, there were as many as 4,000 Roman Sinti living there. There was this night of the 3rd. They were all taken directly to gas chambers. In the morning, on the next day, not a single living Roma or Sinti was there, because Mengele had completed his experiments and he no longer needed the material to work on. So it was August 1944, close to the end of the war. That is when the uprising broke out on the 1st of August. It was an uprising against the Germans. The Germans were to leave the city because the Soviets, the Russians, were on the other side of on the other bank of the river. Poles rose because they wanted to win the capital, but the Germans would return and started destroying the capital. They were given orders to flatten the city. All the inhabitants of the city were to be exterminated. In the first 6 days, in the district of Wola, 50,000 civilians were killed. They would be dragged out of their homes and flats and shot on the street. Their houses would be set on fire. I lived in the very same neighborhood, so a bit later they would be there too. A special camp was set up close to Warsaw. The houses would be set on fire, people would be brought to this camp in Pruszków, a temporary camp, and segregation would take place there. Those who couldn't work would be taken first to Germany for forced labor, and then they would be moved to concentration camps. August the 12th, this is when I was transported here to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Tens of thousands of Warsavians were moved here. Many women were moved to Ravensbrück and men to Buchenwald and other camps in Germany. Also here. So, what are we celebrating today? We are celebrating the liberation. This is when the camp stopped its operation. When it happened, there were few inmates. The Germans were truly perfidious. You could hear the shots of approaching front line, and yet they decided to take the inmates out of the camp and try to move them elsewhere. So those that had stayed were the sick, the young, pregnant women. So when the camp was liberated, basically only 5 to 10% of inmates were liberated. 100,000 inmates were taken out of here. They were forced on the death march to Wodzisław Śląski and then to other camps. Ravensbrück and one more camp were my stopovers. So I was liberated truly later. People use this expression, prison or concentration camp. It seems innocuous. People were kept there. But the thing is, this camp had been undergoing a number of metamorphoses until it moved into a killing site. I would like to read a quote to you. The war finished in 1945. People all over the world were in euphoria. Never again was the slogan. People believed that the war would never happen again. Picasso painted this dove of peace. And yet, there were people who made certain predictions. They predicted that it is impossible for these things never to happen again. Because people became so inhuman that it might happen again. In 1950, a Polish writer and essayist wrote something about the war. Now, he wrote a lot about the war and war in general. He published these articles, these columns, and let me read out to you his words. He wrote the following: if Europe, ravaged by these follies, is to avoid destruction, its people must learn to anticipate better the consequences of their actions. They must not disregard those who possess such foresight. For the older generation, this may be of lesser concern. My thoughts are with the young, those who have their lives ahead of them. War and chaos can erupt anywhere, leaving no place or reason to flee. Thank you very much.
Szanowni Państwo, o
Ladies and
zabranie
gentlemen,
głosu proszę
may
ocalałą
I
z
now
obozu
ask
Auschwitz, panią
Mestova Friedman, Auschwitz survivor, to take the floor.
This is Tova Friedman coming up there. She is an American Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. She was just 5 years old when she was taken to Auschwitz.
Thank you. Hi. January 27th. My whole life, since I was a little girl, I thought of it as my birthday. This is my birthday, January 27th. I celebrate it every single year. In fact, today I got all kinds of emails. Some of my friends don't even know that I have a regular birthday, because this is what counts. Never did I imagine that I would celebrate this year with such a fabulous audience, so many people, such important people. And it's an honor. It's an honor to be there. It's an honor to address you, and I want to thank you to listen to me, because I represent the children. There are very few of us are left. From my town, 4 children survived. So I'm here to talk about those who aren't here, and I'm very honored to speak to this kind of audience that has come from all over the world to mourn, remember, and honor the memory of our people who were so brutally murdered by the Nazis. However, we are also here to proclaim and to pledge that we will never, never, ever allow history to repeat itself. I would like to share some of my memories, because I know that there are many survivors here who are struggling with their own. I was just 6.5 years old when I was liberated from Auschwitz. But my memories are very vivid, thanks to my mother, who constantly validated the events to me as they were happening. When she was with me, she never, ever covered anything up. I remember, as a 5.5-year-old child, watching from my hiding place in Starchowitz labor camp, as all my little friends were rounded up and driven to their deaths, while the heartbreaking cries of their parents fell on deaf ears. After all the children were gone and the courtyard was empty, I thought to myself, am I the only Jewish child left in the world? Shortly thereafter, we were loaded into cattle cars. The men and women were separated. This was the very first time I ever saw my father cry. Up until then, no matter what horrors, no matter what happened to us, we were together. the three of us. We were a family. But now he was sent to Dachau, and my mother and I here to this camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Hot, hungry, thirsty, and very terrified, I held on tightly to my mother's hand in the dark cattle car for countless hours, while the cries and the prayers of so many desperate women permeated my soul and haunt me to this day. Finally, we arrived at Auschwitz, a gloomy Sunday with a sky obscured by smoke and a terrible stink hung in the air. And there were rows and rows of naked women all around me. What are they looking for? I asked my mother as I too was naked. And I tried to avoid the gleam of the German shepherd's teeth and their eyes. I was their height, so I can see them completely. I can still see their eyes to this day. My mother answered me, diseases. But if we are ill, she didn't have to finish. She pointed to the smoke right by the entrance. I knew at 5.5 what that meant. We all knew. As I was being beaten mercilessly by a guard for fidgeting, for not being able to stand still for hours at an appel, a roll call, I looked into my mother's eyes. She was standing next to me, silently, and she was pleading with me, don't cry, hold on. And I didn't. I recall thinking, I will never let them know how much they are hurting me. At 5.5, I had the rebellion in me. I will not show them. I will not let them know the pain they're inflicting on me. I am sure that many of you here who are Holocaust survivors have their own memories, and you remember when your entire being rebelled, but you felt powerless, abandoned, so you just had to resign. On an icy, windy day, I stood and watched helplessly as little girls from the nearby barrack were marched away, crying and shivering, to the gas chamber. They were covered with rags, and some of them didn't even have any shoes and were walking barefoot in the snow. They were very young, as I was, 6 or 7, but starvation shrunk their bodies, and they appeared even younger. They too became ashes. Is my barrack next? I silently wondered. I thought that we all have to die, that it was normal. If you're a Jewish child, you have to die. I wasn't even sure what Jewish was. because I never saw any celebrations. But death, child, Jewish, seemed a normal thought. I knew nothing about partisans saving Jews from ghettos and camps. I knew nothing about the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, nor of the Allies and the D-Day, nor of the invasion of Normandy. At that time, we were victims in a moral vacuum. But today, however, we have an obligation not only to remember, which is very, very important, but also to warn and to teach that hatred only begets more hatred, killing more killing. Instead, our revenge has been to build a strong Jewish country and raise our families in peace. Many of you here, I saw, have your wonderful families with you, just as I do. 80 years after liberation, the world is again in crisis. Our Jewish Christian values have been overshadowed worldwide by prejudice, fear, suspicion, and extremism. And the rampant anti-Semitism that is spreading among the nations is shocking. It's shocking to all of us, to our children and our grandchildren. Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, is fighting for its very existence and its way of life. We mourn not only the fallen soldiers and the hostages, but also the turbulence and mistrust in our society. We pray for strength, resilience, and of course, hope, which has to be part of our daily life. We all of us, must reawaken our collective conscience to transform this violence, anger, hatred, and malignancy that has so powerfully gripped our society into a humane and just world before these terrible, terrible negative forces will destroy us all. It is an enormous task, but our Jewish sages teach us the time is short, the task is great. We may not be able to complete it, but we have an obligation to start. Thank you.
O zabranie głosu proszę ocalałego z obozu Auschwitz,
May I now ask
pana Leona
Mr.
Weintrauba.
Leon Weintraub, the Holocaust survivor, to take the floor.
And just to tell you a little bit about Mr. Weintraub as he walks up there, he was born in Poland. He then moved to Sweden after he escaped from Auschwitz. That was in 1944. He did, though, spend time at another camp. That was the camp of Gross Rosen. Let's listen to him now.
Drodzy I bardzo mi bliscy, ocaleni
Dear
tego
esteemed survivors
nazistowskiego obozu,
of the Nazi concentration camp,
wielce szanowni przedstawiciele
distinguished representatives of governmental, organizational, and religious authorities, dear guests from near and far.
urodziłem się
I was born
w Łodzi
in
1
Łódź
stycznia roku
on the 1st of January 1926.
Mam więc teraz
So I am 99 years old.
po śmierci ojca
After my father's death,
półtora roku,
when I was just 18 months, this was 1927, my mother converted all available resources into capital and she opened a small laundry business at Kamienna Street, which is now Włókiennicza Street. And then the entire family,
żyliśmy
comprising of my mother and her 5 children, we occupied just 2 small rooms. This is where we lived and this
dla
is
całej rodziny.
where she worked.
Zacząłem szkołę podstawową.
Now I started my primary school and I was a good student,
W związku z tym
so
po 6. klasie
after the 6th
szkoły
grade,
podstawowej otrzymałem
I got
miejsce
admitted
bezpłatne
free of charge to a Pilsudski gymnasium at Sienkiewicza Street in Łódź. And I was about to start my further education on the 1st of September 1939. Now, the invasion of our country by the Nazi army disrupted these plans. And in the winter of 1940,
nastąpiła przymusowa
we were
przeprowadzka
forcibly moved to the ghetto Litzmannstadt that the Nazi established. While in the ghetto, I worked in the Metal 1 department, and I spent them there almost 5 years. 5 years of hard labor
oraz chroniczny,
and
nieustający
constant hunger.
w sierpniu 1900
In August 1944,
rozpoczęła
the
się
liquidation
likwidacja getta,
of the ghetto
a
began,
my zostaliśmy
and we were
deportowani
deported
do
to
Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Moją mamę i
My mother
siostrę
and her sister, my auntie Eve,
zamordowano tego
were
samego
murdered
dnia
on the
w
same day in the gas
spalono w
chamber,
krematorium.
and then they were burned in the crematorium.
Po tym nastąpiła
And then
procedura pozbawienia nas
We were
człowieczeństwa,
stripped of all our humanity.
począwszy od odebrania
First,
domaga
we were stripped naked
i odebrania wszelkiego
and
osobistego,
robbed
żeśmy mieli
of
przy
all
sobą.
our personal
Przez
belongings.
brutalne usunięcie owłosienia,
Then they brutally shaved all
często
our
dla
hair,
skóry,
quite often
okropnie paliło
with
potem
painful
przy
skill
dezynfekcji.
removal, which was so painful when carbolic fluid was used to disinfect.
Następnie ubrania,
And then we were
na
dressed
blachy,
in rags,
kurtkę, koszulę i spodnie.
trousers, shirts, jackets.
Potem pokazano nam na
And then
stos drewnianych butów.
clogs, wooden clogs.
Tak nas
This is
zdegradowano
how we were
do
reduced
przedmiotów
to mere
jednorazowego użytku.
disposable items.
Cierpiałem bardzo
I
samotnie,
suffered a lot.
tak
I felt
brutalnie
utterly
oddzielony
alone.
od
I was so
rodziny.
brutally separated from my
Bardzo
family.
dokuczał ten
I
czarny,
also suffered because of this
cuchnący
constant
spalonym
black
mięsem dym,
smoke
który
reeking of burnt
nieustannie
flesh
unosił się z kominów.
that was rising from the chimneys. This was particularly maddening. After a few weeks,
Umknąć
I managed to sneak out illegally of Auschwitz-Birkenau,
niezauważony przez
unnoticed
kapo
by the capos
SS-manów,
and SS men.
dołączyłem do grupy
I joined a group of prisoners who were selected to work outside of the camp.
Birkenau,
In Birkenau, which was a sub-camp of Gross Rosen, I worked as an electrician. In late February 1945, after a 3-day death march, we were transported to the Flossenburg camp, and then a month later to the Natzweiler Stutthof Offenburg camp. I was liberated by the French troops near Donaueschingen on the 20th of April 1945. As I was diagnosed with general debility and I only weighed 35 kilos, I was also diagnosed with typhus, I had to be hospitalized for several weeks, first in Donaueschingen, and then I was stationed at the French military sanatorium on the Reichenau Peninsula. In the autumn of 1946, I started my medical studies in Göttingen. I returned to Poland in November 1950. And after graduation in 1954, I worked at the Clinic of Obstetrics and Women's Diseases of the Medical Academy in Warsaw. But owing to rising anti-Semitism in Poland, I lost my job in February 1969, where I was the head of the obstetrics and gynecology department in Otwock Hospital. So in September 1969, I emigrated to neutral Sweden together with my family. Today, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz camp. This Nazi concentration camp symbolizes the unprecedented cruelty in the treatment of people throughout history. This is a place where the techniques of mass and industrial murder were first introduced. It grieves me deeply to see in many European countries, but also in Poland, Nazi-style uniforms and slogans openly paraded at marches. It grieves me to see that this is happening without any consequences. These people self-proclaim themselves as national champions, but at the same time, they proclaim the hateful ideology of German Nazis. This is the ideology that murdered millions who were considered subhuman under the sign of the swastika. So this ideology, an attitude that preaches hostility and hatred towards others, this defines racism, anti-Semitism and homophobia as virtues. And this is occurring here in our country, which has suffered so much, which has endured extensive damage under the Nazi occupation. I urge all people of goodwill, and especially I ask of the young people, be sensitive to all expressions of intolerance and resentment towards those who are different, regardless of their skin color, religion, or sexual orientation. In today's digital world, it is so incredibly challenging to distinguish between genuine intention and the pursuit of popularity, the need to exist that stems from a conscious and persistent agenda. I repeat, therefore, be attentive and be vigilant. We, the survivors, we understand that the consequence of being considered different is active persecution, the effects of which we have personally experienced. And we did experience it very hard. So let us be very serious and let's take seriously what the enemies of democracy preach. They generally seek to implement these slogans they promote. If they succeed in gaining power, we must avoid the mistake of the 1930s, when the world failed to take seriously the Nazi regimes and the plans to create a state free of Jews, Roma, and people of different opinions, or sick, or those deemed unfit to live, were underestimated. Therefore, I implore everybody to intensify their efforts in countering the views that led to the genocide we are commemorating today. Modern understanding of our heritage and our DNA confirms that there is but only one race of humans, Homo sapiens. Therefore, the theory of racism, which is a fundamental principle of Nazi ideology, is false and incompatible with reality. Let me assure you, as a doctor, as a gynecologist, when I perform operations, whatever the patient's skin, the tissues beneath are identical in every person. Astronomers tell us that there are trillions of solar systems and galaxies, and that are similar to ours. Our planet is merely a speck in the vast cosmos. Isn't it absurd to divide the inhabitants of the speck into thousands of disparate groups that are often and sadly hostile to each other? Every year, there are lengthy discussions taking place in parliaments regarding budget cuts. Significant amounts are, however, allocated to armaments. In contrast, the peaceful coexistence of nations could be achieved without any financial cost. Just think about the positive impact this expenditure could create. I wish to express my gratitude and appreciation to the management and all the staff of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum for their tireless efforts in preserving the memory of the victims of the Nazi ideology and for combating prejudice and hostility toward others. Well, allowing the memory of millions of innocent victims to fade would be equivalent to robbing them of their lives for a second time. The commemoration of the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz serves as a reminder of the inhumane treatment of individuals, but also it is a warning against the increasingly vocal movements of the radical and anti-democratic right. I kindly ask everyone now to stand and observe with a moment of silence the memory of the victims of the degenerate German nationalism. Thank you.
We're listening to some music now by Szymon Laks, a Polish Jewish composer. He was deported to Auschwitz in 1942 and then to Dachau 2 years later, where he was liberated.
O zabranie głosu
May I
proszę
ask to the
przedstawiciela
floor representative of Pillars of Remembrance, the largest private donors of the Fund for Retaining Authenticism of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Mr. Ronald S. Lauder.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Auschwitz survivors who are with us today. And the leaders of more than 50 countries, royal families, and heads of state who came here today to honor the memory of those who died here. Thank you. Ten years ago, in 2015, Auschwitz survivor Roman Kent stood here on this platform at the 70th anniversary of the liberation, and he said these words: "We don't want our past to be our children's future." Let me repeat that again. We don't want our past to be our children's future. Roman Kent died 6 years later, but his words haunt us today, because if Roman Kent were here and saw what was happening to the Jewish people around the world in 2025, he would cry. It's hard for us to believe what we see today, the sudden violence of hatred against Jews, the singling out of the one Jewish state with huge demonstrations shouting anti-Semitic slurs everywhere. This is hard for us to watch. any of us. But I cannot imagine what it must be like for the almost 50 survivors here who are with us today. What Roman Ked said, and all of you lived through, we are watching right now in front of our eyes. Earlier, you heard Tova Friedman tell a story of watching children separate from their parents and taken to gas chambers. We know that 1.5 million children were killed in the Holocaust, the most heartbreaking number in an ocean of heartbreak. But 15 months ago, not 80 years ago, we saw Jewish children slaughtered, once again, for one reason, because they were born Jewish. In a very fundamental way, what happened in Israel on October 7th and what happened here at Auschwitz have one common thread: the age-old hatred of Jews. On January 27th, 1945, when the Red Army entered these gates, the world finally saw where the step-by-step progression of anti-Semitism leads. It leads right here. The gas chambers, the piles of bodies, and the horrors within these gates. But what led up to the Holocaust's final outcome? It began slowly, first when Jews were singled out in universities, excluded from jobs, with boycotts and attacks in the media. Yes, it began slowly, and then it happened all at once. Throughout the 1930s, the hatred against Jews may have been ignited by Hitler in Germany and Austria, but in France, Italy, even England and the United States, there were strong forces that supported this hatred. France had Marcel Boucard, Jacques Doriot, and Francois Coty. England had Oswald Mosley. Italy had Mussolini. And the US, there was the German Bund. Henry Ford was a huge anti-Semite, as were Father Conklin, and believe it or not, even Charles Lindbergh. Today, we see eerie parallels throughout the world, throughout Europe, North America, even Australia. Jewish students have been singled out and threatened in universities. Today, Jewish professors have been fired. Today, Jewish children have been told to hide any outward signs of being Jewish. Today, there are mass demonstrations against Jews. Today, we see vile comments all over social media. Need I remind you, this is not 1933 or 1939. This is 2025. The hatred of Jews had its willing supporters then, and it has them now. You can't be Jewish or non-Jewish and not be concerned with what you see all around us today. But here, at these gates, we are forced to face one great question when we tell the story of Auschwitz. Everyone knows what happened here, but no one seems to know why it happened. Yes, it was a step-by-step process, and it was aided by those who hated Jews. But it was advanced by the indifference of people who thought they were not affected by anti-Semitism because they were not Jewish. It was a world silence that led to Auschwitz. When Hitler heard that silence after Kristallnacht in 1938, he knew he could do anything he wanted with the Jews. Kristallnacht may have been on page 1 of some newspapers, but it quickly disappeared. World leaders said nothing. On my first visit here at Auschwitz, I was accompanied by a famous survivor, Elie Wiesel. We were walking away from the gas chambers, and the sun was setting. Elie paused for a moment, and then he said something I will never forget. You know, he said, most people think the opposite of love is hate. It's not. It's indifference. Today it's the same story. Silence, indifference, and the exception of this hatred. So today, all of us must take a pledge to never be silent when it comes to anti-Semitism, or for that matter, any other hatred. These lessons for Auschwitz are not just for Jews, they're for the entire world. That's because Jews are the canaries in the coal mine. When the canary dies, miners know they have to get out of that mine as fast as possible. That canary died 15 months ago on October 7th. And that is the most consequential warning for the entire world. Yes, yes, Hitler went after the Jews first. But when it was all over, more than 60 million human beings were dead. And this continent lay in ruins. Over 1 million Jews were killed here at Auschwitz. But they were not alone. 70,000 Polish Christians who thought they might be safe were also murdered right here, along with the others. When I spoke here 5 and 10 years ago, I talked about the horrors that Jewish survivors lived through. But I always spoke about it in the past. It never occurred to me that this could happen again. Of course, I'm not talking about gas chambers, but attacks on the Jewish people, the boycotts, the targeting, the exclusion could not be more real. And yes, they're really happening. But here is a crucial point. These attacks are not just targeting Jews. They are attacking Judeo-Christian beliefs, which is the bedrock of Western civilization. When we hear the chants like globalized intifada or death to Israel, what they are really saying is death to Western civilization. How do you stop this? Today, we have a generation that is led by social media, indoctrinated by activist teachers, and aided by a complacent population. They're complacent because they don't see it as their problem. But please believe me, it is all of our problems. Today in the US, 87% of Americans 30 and over fully support Israel's right to exist, just as every other country has exactly the same numbers. But for Americans under 30, the number drops to 40%. No right to exist? Almost half of all younger Americans don't believe Israel has a right to exist. And they are our future leaders. Let me tell you, this is not just happening in America. It is happening to young people in every single country that is represented here. Just as in my country, young people are getting most of their information from social media, and that is dangerous. Education, serious, honest education, is the only way to correct this, and that won't be easy. Entire institutions will have to be overhauled and corrected, and that goes for the media as well. Keeping opinions out of news would be a good start. So today, I cannot stand here and look at these survivors and say that everything is okay, as I have in the past, because everything is not okay. Roman Kent's words haunt us. So let today be the day we all of us, world leaders and ordinary citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish, old and young, make a solemn pledge to stop this now before it's too late. We must, you must, and that's every one of your countries. No hatred of Jewish people or any people is tolerated at all. Remember, it wasn't just Jews that died here. Practically every single prime minister, president, king here today lost millions of their own countrymen in a war to defeat this hatred. 80 years ago, millions of young men gave up their lives so these gas chambers were turned off forever. That means millions of young men, I should say women, never had the chance to live out their lives, to fall in love, to have families, to do good work, to watch their children grow up. They gave up everything so we would live in a free and safe world. More than 60 million human beings died, 6 million of them Jews. We will never know what the world lost in all these deaths, the cures for disease, the great works of art, music, and literature. So much is lost with each life that was extinguished. Our future, the future of the entire world, depends on which direction young people take. They have a choice to go on the old road of hatred once again, or they can summon up the courage to stand up to these hatreds swirling around them. All of us have a choice as well. We can leave here and go back to our 50 different countries and assume it's not our problem. Or we can leave here united in our determination to stop this hate rising up in our world, united in our determination to guide our young people in the right direction, united as one. I've been involved with Auschwitz for more than 50 years, since the 25th anniversary in 1970. On my first visit, I saw how time elements were taking their toll. I realized that if no efforts were made to preserve Auschwitz, it would soon disappear. So I took it upon myself to start that process, to make sure that Auschwitz would stand for all time as the strongest lesson for all humanity. What we see here today reflects what Auschwitz looked like in 1945. So future generations will see and learn the lessons of Auschwitz. And I salute the many people who helped me in this endeavor with the same commitment. I hope Roman Kent is looking at us now, knowing that we do everything in our power to make sure that his warning does not come to pass. Don't worry, Roman. We will fight this hatred with renewed determination. And I firmly believe that the good will triumph in the end. Finally, I would like to convey what this place, Auschwitz, means to me. Not as a survivor, not as a liberator, but simply as a Jew, who cared deeply about my fellow Jews. On that first visit here so long ago, I was struck by a thought that every Jew must have when they come to Auschwitz. What if I'd been born in Budapest in 1944, where my grandparents came from, instead of New York, where they settled? What would have happened to me? You all know the answers to that question. I feel a deep personal connection to this place, this platform where over 1 million people arrived. I was drawn to this place. I try to come here as often as possible. Every visit, I would always stop at the train station on Avincian and buy flowers. And then I would find a rock, and I would lay the flowers at the tombstone out there. I would put the rock on top of the memorial that many of us have done for the more than 1 million men, women, and children whose souls swirl around us. I would say a special prayer, the prayer you know. I felt then and I feel now. I tie to each one of them. It's hard to explain, but it's profound, and it's a major part of who I am. I've spoken here in past commemorations. Today, I must be realistic. This may well be the last commemoration, and also that I will speak at. But I leave today with the understanding I did my best. I did my utmost to be worthy of the memory of all those who were lost there. I tried my best. Hope I was worthy. God bless the memory, and God bless all of you. Thank you.
Głos oddaję panu dyrektorowi, opiekunowi miejsca pamięci
Director,
Auschwitz-Birkenau,
guardian of
doktorowi
the
Piotrowi Cywińskiemu.
Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial, Dr. Piotr Cywiński.
Gdy byłem dzieckiem,
When I was a child,
mówiłem jak dziecko,
I spoke like a child,
czułem jak dziecko,
felt like a child,
myślałem jak
and
dziecko.
thought like a child.
Kiedy zaś stałem się mężczyzną,
But when I became an
pozbyłem
adult,
się tego, co dziecięce,
I left behind the ways of childhood,
poza pamięcią.
except for memory.
Bo ona pozostaje z najwcześniejszych
Memory
nawet
endures,
doświadczeń.
even from the earliest experiences of our lives.
Pamięć i doświadczenie są tym,
Today,
co
we
musimy
must reflect
przemyśleć.
upon memory and experience.
Zrozumiałem to dorastając,
I realized
a
this as I grew
najbardziej
up,
tutaj,
and most importantly,
nigdzie bardziej.
in this very place. Nowhere else have I matured
Poznałem
more.
Auschwitz dzięki
After
wam.
all, I became aware of Auschwitz
Ocalałem.
thanks to you, and through you, survivors.
Każdy wiek
Every generation needs a lens to evaluate its
A
time.
dziś stoimy wszyscy w tej
Today,
naszej
we all
dorosłej
stand together,
perspektywie.
looking at the world
I
through the
musimy
lens of
spojrzeć
our
w siebie i zapytać,
adulthood.
Co zrobiliśmy z
We must look within ourselves and ask, what have we done with memory? Memory is polyphonic.
Dzieli i łączy
It both
pokolenia.
divides and unites generations.
Samego w moim doświadczeniu zarówno podzieliła i połączyła.
It has divided and united me in my own experience too.
Podzielony i
For 18
połączony.
years, I have stood here, experiencing both division and unity.
Uczymy historii.
We teach history,
To nie jest to samo,
but
co
this
uczenie
is not
pamięci.
the same as teaching memory.
Historia to znajomość
History
faktów.
is the knowledge of facts.
Pamięć to ich świadomość.
Memory
Właśnie
is
tak
the awareness
potrzebna
of
dziś.
those facts, which is precisely what we so
Historia nie
desperately
tworzy
need
traumy.
today.
Natomiast
History
pamięć
does not create
może.
trauma. Memory can.
Pamięć jest kluczem
Memory
do dzisiejszego
is the key
świata
to understanding today's
i
world
projektowania przyszłego.
and designing tomorrow's.
A tymczasem nadal
Yet
uczymy
we continue
tylko
to focus
historii,
solely on
a
teaching
nie
history,
pamięci.
not memory.
Nasze programy
Our
edukacji
educational
muszą
programs must be changed.
Muszą,
They must.
gdyż
Because
pamięć
memory
nie jest
is
kwestią
not just a
kultury,
matter of culture.
jest kwestią
It is a matter of
tożsamości.
clarity, identity.
Stoimy tu z ludźmi odpowiedzialnymi
We
za
standing
dzisiejszy
here
świat.
with the people who bear responsibility for the world we live in today.
Urodziłem się po wojnie.
Like you, I was born after the
Jakby nie
war.
pamiętam tamtych
Like you,
czasów.
I
A
don't
jak
remember
wy,
those times.
wsłuchiwałem się w
Like
opowieści
you,
ocalałych.
I listened to the stories of the survivors.
Ale co dziś robię?
But what am I doing today?
A co zaniedbuję?
And what am I neglecting?
Jakie decyzje podejmuję
What
dziś?
decisions
I
do
czy
I
są
make
one
today and are
podejmowane
they
na podstawie
guided by
pamięci?
memory?
Pamięć boli,
Memory hurts.
pamięć pomaga,
Memory helps.
pamięć naprowadza,
Memory guides.
pamięć ostrzega,
Memory warns.
pamięć uświadamia,
Memory raises awareness.
pamięć zobowiązuje.
Memory obliges.
Kim jesteś bez pamięci?
Who are you without
Nie
memory?
masz historii.
Without memory,
Nie
you
masz
have no
doświadczenia,
history,
ani
you have no
punktów
experience,
odniesień.
and no point of reference.
Jeśli nie masz pamięci,
If you
to
have
nawet
no
nie
memory,
wiesz, którą drogę
You may
wybrać.
not know which path to choose.
Ale jeśli naprawdę
And
jej
if
nie
you
masz,
truly
to
lack memory, be sure
twoi wrogowie
your enemies
wymyślą ci pamięć.
will design one for you.
No i wy,
And
drodzy,
you,
ocalali,
our dear survivors, beloved ones,
przybyliście tu.
you have come here.
Nasza pamięć jest
Our memory
bardzo
is primarily
owocem
shaped
waszych
by our experiences,
owocem waszego
the
życia.
fruit of your lives.
Nie ma słów, drodzy,
There are no words,
jak
dearest
za to wam
ones,
dziękować.
to express the depth of our gratitude.
A co mamy z tym dziś
But
robić?
what are we to do with this memory today?
Przyjaciele,
If today, my
nie
friend,
wiesz, co zrobić.
you feel uncertain about what to
Jeśli dziś
do,
czujesz się bezsilny,
if you
jeśli
feel
dziś nie dajesz
powerless,
rady,
if you feel you cannot go
znaczy,
on,
doszedłeś do granicy.
then perhaps you have
Ale
reached
jeśli
your
tak
limit.
wiesz, że granice są tylko
If so,
wyobraźni.
know that limits are only imaginary. You can always do
Zatem
more.
coś dobrego, tak
Do
jak
something
potrafisz
good then,
najlepiej.
whatever you can,
Zrób to
in the
dla
best
innych,
way you
a
can.
zobaczysz, że zrobiłeś to też
Do it
dla
for
ciebie.
others, and you will find that you
Na
have done it
skalę
for yourself
twoich
as well.
możliwości.
Do it within the
zrób.
scope of your abilities. But do something.
Zdrowiejesz z bezsilności,
Act,
z apatii,
and you will recover from feelings of helplessness and
ale
apathy.
zawsze
Take action.
pamiętaj.
Begin. But
Niech wreszcie
always
twoja pamięć
remember,
zacznie żyć.
let your memory finally come alive today,
Bo
because
właśnie pamięć
your memory
jest twoją
is your
podporą,
pillar,
twoją pomocą,
your aid,
twoim
your
przeczuciem,
instinct,
tobą.
yourself.
All right, shortly now we're going to hear some music. This will be by Gideon Klein. He was a Czech Jewish composer. He was deported to Auschwitz in 1944. He died there in January of 1945, so just before the liberation of the camp. Well, listening to the ceremony with us today has been Jan Grabowski. He's a professor of history, and I'd love to bring you in, Jan, at this point if I can, just to get a sense of your main takeaways from this commemoration so far, because we had been briefed, we've been talking about it beforehand, that this was to be a ceremony without politics, but contemporary fears, contemporary concerns, questions of anti-Semitism were brought up by a few of the speakers. So I just wonder what struck you particularly about what it is that we've heard so far.
Right. I mean, this is a very moving ceremony, and I must say, food for thought for everybody. I know very well, he's a personal friend of mine, Marcin Turski. I've known him for decades. And a few years back, he, from the same podium, he was talking about that Auschwitz did not fall from the sky, that Auschwitz was a luggage that we basically carry with us. And here today, he was quoting Nachman from Wrocław. He was quoting Henryka Lozowert, poems of people, especially Henryka Lozowert, who was murdered in Treblinka. And his idea was, we should not fear. We should be able to confront. And here he ventured into politics, of course. I mean, Holocaust denial, he was speaking about it. And he was talking about October 7. It is something that I thought would be kept more in the background, but you could see that in practically all speeches of Jewish survivors, you would hear echoes of the current horrible, as they call it, explosion, tsunami of anti-Semitism. So this came clearly, and I was particularly moved by Leon Weintraub's words when he was basically an inmate in a Łódź ghetto, then Auschwitz, then death marches, and then he came back to Poland, and he had to flee Poland due to anti-Semitism in 1968-69. So basically the returning wave, and then his beautiful words about that we need to understand that the differences that divide us are skin deep, that once he as a surgeon goes under this skin, the color doesn't matter, with tissue is just the same. So these are powerful words, and I was really very, very impressed and touched by it. On the other hand, interesting thing, when you heard Janina Iwańska, who was the Polish survivor not of the Holocaust. She was a Polish inmate, so she was a survivor of Auschwitz, right? And as a young woman, you could see very different perspectives on the Holocaust and on Auschwitz. One is the perspective of Jews who were sent there to die. The other one was the suffering of Poles who had a working chance to survive. And so these two perspectives are not always being reconciled. But overall, and very moving speech by Tova Friedman in the name of the dead children and children survivors. I mean, the fact that we are looking at mass murder of 1.5 million children is something that gives us a pause. So overall, at the end, you had, of course, Lauder, the president of the Jewish World Congress, with a very political speech. And what I found lacking a bit here was the question. There was actually the president of Ukraine, and no one ever mentioned this word Ukraine.
Jan Grabowski, I'd like to ask you a lot more about all of that, but before we do, we are going to listen now to the Kaddish, a Jewish prayer, a declaration of faith. Let's listen to a little of that.
שנפלו בידי הרוצחים ונשפך דמם באושוויץ, טרבלינקה, מיידניק, סוביבור, בלז'ץ, חלמנו ובשאר מחנות השמדה ועבודה וגטאות באירופה, שנהרגו ושנשרפו ושנשחטו ושנקברו חייהם בכל מיתות משונות ואכזריות על קדושת השם, בעבור שאנחנו בניהם ובנותיהם, אחיהם ואחיותיהם, מתפללים על הזכרת נשמותיהם בגן עדן מנוחתם. לכן ברחמים יסרים בסתר כנפיו לעולמים ויצור בצורכם נשמותם. אדוני הוא נחלתם ינוחה בשלום משכבם ונאמר אמן.
שיר המעלות. ממעמקים קראתיך אדוני, אדוני שמעה וקולי, תהיינה אוזניך קשובות לכל תחנוני. אם עוונות תשמוריה, אדוני מי יעמוד? כי עמך הסליחה למען תברא. קיוויתי אדוני קיוותה נפשי, ולדברו הוחלתי. נפשי לאדוני משומרים לבוקר, שומרים לבוקר. יחל ישראל אל אדוני, כי עם אדוני החסד והרבה עמו פדות. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברך יראותי וימליך מלכותי, ויצמח פורקני ויקרב משיחי. בחיי חון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילם עם כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירם בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה משמעיה, וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
As the heart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God.
Well, let's bring back in Jan Grabowski now, if we can, historian. And Jan, we were speaking a moment ago about your reflections on today. We were talking about some of the speakers, a Polish survivor among those. And you are an expert on Poland, the Polish president among those attending these tributes today. So I'd love to ask you about how much sort of recognition there is in Poland institutionally of what happened on Polish soil, given Auschwitz, this place that we are looking at today, of course, is in Poland.
You know, the history of the Holocaust is the greatest and most, let's say, burning hot potato that there is in Poland. And the problem is, of course, the discussion of levels of Polish complicity during the war within the German genocidal plan. And this is something that triggers extraordinary emotions in Poland, given the fact that Polish society has been a society of victims too. And it's very difficult to come to terms with the fact that a society that has been a victim can also victimize even weaker members of its own social community, national community, in this case, the Jews. So in Poland, it's a great problem. And when you look at the camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka, you can see that repeated attempts are being done by the Polish state to combine the two. In other words, concentration experience, concentration camp experience with the experience of extermination camps, which should not be compared, I would say, at all. So this is a real problem. And in terms of institutions, the Polish state has been engaged now for decades in something that historians of the Shoah call Holocaust distortion. It means we don't deny that 6 million Jews have been murdered, but what we deny is that our people, our nation, had any kind of influence or impact or complicity within that event, with that event. So this kind of let's say a problem persists, exists, and is visible throughout Polish educational system and museums such as Auschwitz II.
And look, when we talk about Polish individuals, you're talking there about the institutional recognition of the state. Your own research has suggested that around 200,000 Jews were killed indirectly or directly as a result of activities of Poles during the Second World War. How much knowledge would you say there is about that, or acceptance of that within Polish society?
Well, I would say acceptance of these are the numbers which are the results of perhaps 20 years of my research, basic research on the ground. And I would call them conservative numbers. As I mentioned, it's a question of direct involvement or indirect denunciation in this case, which I would say sums up with the sum of 200, perhaps more, 100 Polish Jews who had a working chance to live. Because principally and chiefly, we are discussing here the period of time when the Jews were no longer in the ghettos. They fled and they were trying to survive on so-called Aryan side, and they did not survive. So, I mean, the percentage, there was 1% of Polish Jews who found themselves under the German occupation who made it through the war. 1%. So these are horrible numbers, and in question of acceptance, I would say in Poland practically none. I could count perhaps on fingers of one hand historians who would subscribe to these numbers. However, abroad, it's among international historians, the acceptance of my findings is much more common. So this is a problem, and this is a problem of memory indeed, and something that we call unfortunately the wrongly understood reason of the state. In France, you have an expression, raison d'État. So this is a problem in Poland of huge proportions.
We are really running out of time, sir. I'd love to get from you as we wrap up this special programme, in one or two words, what for you are the lessons on the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz?
My goodness, this is unfortunately the same word that we have been repeating, endlessly. Never again. But unfortunately, my hopes is against experience going now, because what we see is never again is happening now. So my plea is basically to add my voice to these voices that we heard here today. Never again, and once again, never again.
Jan Grabowski, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, sir, as we've been watching this special ceremony at Auschwitz honouring the 80 years since the camp was liberated. Thanks to you, and thanks to our viewers as well for watching this special programme. We'll leave you with those live images from the camp there, survivors there being honoured. Thanks for watching, and bye from me.
In the Philippines, a silent epidemic is hitting young people and the LGBT community hard.
From January to June, we already have 5,000 cases reported. It's a good and a bad thing. It's just the tip of the iceberg.
The stigma remains omnipresent.
When I got the result, I was stunned. I think